Okay, so part 2. The board supervise the chief executive officer. Their job is to stay abreast of things such as finances and to make sure the chief executive officer is running the organisation well. The chief executive officer provides the board with the information they need. The board has the right to obtain information from the chief executive officer. The board also, of course, support the chief executive officer. Now, board members have a right to exercise their rights as directors, and they have a right to seek information, to seek advice, and to voice their concerns. Directors must act in the best interests of the corporation or organisation. They have a legal obligation to ensure that everything they do and the board does is transparent and is in the best interest of the organisation or corporation and its members. Of course, they must not use their positions on the board for any personal gain, and they must avoid any possibility of that perception. Directors must comply with 2 sets of duties: fiduciary duties, where they must act with good trust and honesty, and statutory duties. Now, these are set out in what's known as the CATSI Act. Capital C, capital A, capital T, capital S, capital I Act, capital ACT, which I'm going to talk about a bit later. In fact, after you have listened to this audio recording, have a look at the Office of the Register of Indigenous Corporations website. Okay, so that's the Office of the Register of Indigenous Corporations website, ORIC, O-R-I-C. Now, earlier I mentioned that no Indigenous organisation or corporation in Australia exists independently of Western governance rules. In Australia, the regulator of Indigenous organisations and corporations is ORIC, the Office of the Register of Indigenous Corporations. Now, if any Indigenous organisation or corporation want to be officially recognised as such, they must register with ORIC. To do this, they must comply with ORIC guidelines. These include a wide range of things, such as having a constitution, staying abreast of and providing ORIC with all financial records, membership details, minutes of meetings, etc. They also ensure that corporations and organisations have things such as minutes of meetings, meeting rules such as how many people constitute a quorum, which is how many people must be present before a board actually begins an official meeting, when meetings need to be held, etc. Typically, Indigenous organisations and corporations develop their own constitutions, and these constitutions, as I said, must adhere to ORIC requirements and include things such as having annual general meetings, conflict resolution policies, and processes for determining organisation membership and board membership. If Indigenous organisations and corporations are not complying with the requirements of ORIC, they can lose their status as an organisation or corporation. At worst, directors can end up in court if they have neglected their responsibilities as directors or have acted inappropriately with finances, for example. What typically happens if an Indigenous corporation or organisation is not adhering to ORIC expectations is ORIC will send in an administrator. So they'll have a list of all of the private companies who do that sort of work, administration, auditing and all that sort of stuff. They will contact one of them and pay one of them, well, depending on the situation, maybe the organisation will pay the administrator, and as soon as ORIC engage the administrator, the chief executive officer and the board loses their power, and the administrator has the power. Now, what the administrator typically done in these situations is he gets rid of the board that was there at the time and he replaces it with a new, fresh board. The aim here is for the administrator to work with the corporation, the board and ORIC to get the corporation back on track, not to come in heavy-handed and step on people. Now, typically, if Indigenous organisations or corporations, as I said, are experiencing problems, ORIC will try to help them by engaging an administrator. Some of the things that Indigenous organisations and corporations must adhere to include things such as formal meeting arrangements and documenting these meetings through minutes. Minutes provide legal records of who said what and what was actually discussed. Other things include having annual general meetings, for example, and how long the board have to inform members of annual general meetings or special meetings. Now, often you will see these in public notice sections in the newspaper. Organisations and corporations must provide their members with public notice of upcoming annual general meetings, and they must do this within a certain time that is determined by their own constitutions. For example, their constitution may state that they have 14 days to notify their members of an annual general meeting. Then, the order and process of these annual general meetings are also determined by the organisation or corporation's constitution. This includes things such as who can chair the meeting, the order of business, who can attend the meeting, what happens with conflict at meetings, and who can actually participate in meetings. These annual general meetings must be held every year. If an Indigenous organisation or corporation must postpone an annual general meeting for any reason, they must obtain permission from ORIC. Annual general meetings must be held every year so members of corporations and organisations have an opportunity to be provided with information about the organisation or corporation and to ask whatever questions they want. There are many important issues in governance that Indigenous people are struggling to overcome. Some are doing well, however, some experience problems that are a direct outcome of conflict between Indigenous, social and cultural norms and Western governance rules. Now, sometimes these problems are a direct result of Indigenous people not fully being aware of what constitutes good Western governance and not fully understanding their roles as directors. For example, if Indigenous people have low levels of education and low levels of English, they are probably not going to be aware of Western governance processes. They may also have low levels of confidence that prevent them from asking questions of a chief executive officer, for example. Directors not being aware of their roles as directors can be a huge problem for Indigenous organisations and corporations. They can engage in and promote poor governance processes as a result. For example, they can intentionally or unintentionally perpetuate conflict of interest. Now, conflict of interest can occur, for example, when a board member also works at the organisation or corporation. This is because they work for the Chief Executive Officer at work. Then, at board level, they supervise the Chief Executive Officer. This is a conflict of interest, as the board member, who is also a staff member, may support the CEO so long as they can retain their job. So, for example, if a Chief Executive Officer is in a relationship with somebody, or a Chief Executive Officer has employed people from her social network or family network, and then these people are then on the board, oftentimes these people can make decisions that support the CEO which are not in the best interests of the organisation, because their interest then becomes about looking after their boss so their boss can look after them. The organisation and members' interests come second. This is an example of conflict of interest. Conflict of interest has the potential to cause many governance problems for Indigenous organisations and corporations. This is because of the kinship system, which includes both biological and social relationships, and also includes limited employment opportunities because of low levels of education and remoteness. The best way to prevent things such as conflict of interest is for Indigenous organisations and corporations to make it clear in their constitutions that board members cannot be staff, and this requires the rest of the board and the members to be strong about this. When there are other conflicts of interest, such as the board voting on whether to extend the CEO's contract, and a board member is related to the CEO, the best and most practical thing to do is for that board member to openly declare their conflict of interest and to leave the room until that particular vote and discussion is complete. So, John the CEO is my brother, therefore I am going to leave the room while the discussion about renewing his contract occurs, and I'll come back in the room once that's complete. And could you please document in the minutes that I am leaving the room while this discussion takes place because of this reason. Again, that is the most practical and simple way to avoid conflict of interest and allow good, honest, open governance. Again, this is about openness and transparency. For example, the minutes will state, as I said, that I left the room while the CEO's contract was discussed, as I am the CEO's brother or uncle or whatever. So, good governance provides structure and order. Good governance is about showing clearly that the board members are following a structured and ordered process and are being honest and transparent. As I said, if Indigenous people want to be in charge of their own affairs and have more control of their own affairs, they need to get familiar with good Western governance processes. So take a little time now to look at the ORIC website. You can have a look at the CATSI Act, which spells out all of the things Indigenous organisations and corporations must comply with in order to be recognised and remain recognised as an official corporation or organisation. You can even do a search on the website by an individual Indigenous corporation, and view the documents of that Indigenous corporation. Now, this is not meant to be secret documents, confidential documents. This is about being transparent, okay? Honest and open. So all of these documents are available to any of us whenever we want them, okay, through the ORIC website. So I hope you've got a little bit out of today's lecture. It was in 3 parts, but the readings and the activities and that website that I've asked you to have a look at all complement this lecture rather well. Thank you again for your time.